Welcome back to another edition of the Ogletree Outlook. I'm your host, James Ogletree, and if I can put on my best Brent Musberger impression here for a minute, we've got a dandy of a football game on our hands tonight. The number 2 Alabama Crimson Tide hosting the number 3 ranked Georgia Bulldogs in Bryant-Denny Stadium, and it just doesn't get much better than that, folks. In a game with massive SEC and college football playoff and national championship implications, what we really are going to be treated to tonight in Bryant-Denny Stadium is the classic unstoppable force hitting the immovable object. Alabama's offense, of course, is the unstoppable force, scoring 51 points per game, the most in the FBS, and ranking number 1 in offensive efficiency, going up against Georgia's defense, which allows just 12 points per game, and is ranked number 1 in defensive efficiency. There are matchups all over the field to preview and to talk about, and that's really my goal with this podcast, preview, whatever you want to call it, is to just help you guys, my listeners, learn more about Alabama's next matchup. And there is no shortage of things to talk about for this Alabama-Georgia game, so let's get right into it. I want to talk about, I'll talk about one side of the ball and then the other. So we'll start with Alabama's offense going up against that Georgia defense. Alabama's offense is facing a stark contrast in the quality of defense that it's playing from last week to this week. Literally, it's going from playing the worst run defense in the FBS to the best run defense in the FBS. Georgia's defense ranks number 1 in the FBS in yards per carry allowed, yards per game allowed, and rushing touchdowns allowed. They have only allowed 710 total yards in 3 games this year. 710 rushing plus passing this year for Georgia. Ole Miss has allowed 910 rushing yards in 3 games. So the Rebels have allowed 200 more rushing yards than Georgia has allowed total yards. So that kind of tells you this week might be a little bit tougher to move the ball for Mac Jones and that elite Alabama offense. To put it another way, Alabama had 723 total yards last week against Ole Miss, and Georgia has allowed 710 yards in those 3 games. Georgia's run defense, as I said, has been especially dominant. They've allowed just 1 run all year longer than 11 yards, and that was a 19-yarder in the final minute against Arkansas when the Bulldogs were clinging to a slim 27-point lead. Tennessee didn't have a run longer than 8 yards last week against Georgia, and the week before that, Auburn's longest run was 10 yards. So this Georgia defense really does a good job of limiting the explosive runs. They only allowed 93 rush yards to Arkansas, 58 to Auburn, and 45 to Tennessee. So they started excellent, and they're just increasing and lowering the amount of rush yards that they're allowing each week. Each of those totals excludes sacks because, as I've talked about before on the Ogletree Outlook, it is stupid and pointless and dumb that the NCAA counts quarterback sacks toward rushing yards. Anyway, looking back to Ole Miss last week, Najee Harris had a career game, which I predicted on last week's episode of the Ogletree Outlook, if I may hype myself up a little bit. But Najee Harris with a career high 206 rushing yards and 5 touchdowns. Whew. That's getting it done on the ground. That ties the school record for most rushing touchdowns in a game. But I think we better pump the brakes a little bit. It looked like that running game with Najee Harris and the offensive line really found something last week. But like I said, Ole Miss's defensive front is not Georgia's defensive front. I think if Najee Harris has 20 carries for 80 yards tonight against Georgia, I think we should consider that a win for Alabama. Georgia's ability to stop the run is just that good. A key matchup I would advise you to keep an eye on is Georgia's nose tackle Jordan Davis. He's 6'6", 330 pounds, going up against the interior of Alabama's line, especially center Landon Dickerson, who is, in my opinion, one of Alabama's 2 best offensive linemen, along with Alex Leatherwood. Some of you listeners may believe Dickerson is Alabama's best lineman, and I will not argue with that. But Jordan Davis, Georgia's nose tackle, was a preseason first-team All-SEC type of player, and just that size that he brings, 6'6", 330. Alabama hasn't played anybody like that yet this year. You know, they've played Texas A&M. Bobby Brown's a good player. DeMarvin Leal is a former 5-star. Kobe Whiteside, a defensive tackle for Missouri, is a good player. But 6'6", 330, first-team All-SEC, that tells you all you need to know about Jordan Davis's ability to clog rushing lanes and just wreak havoc on the inside of that Alabama offensive line. So that'll be a very difficult test for them, especially Emil Ekiyor, who's making just his 4th start. He's the only member of Alabama's offensive line who was not a starter last year. It'll be interesting to see how much he goes against Jordan Davis and how he's able to play against Jordan Davis. The other key members of Georgia's run defense I want you to focus on are their 2 main inside linebackers. They have a little bit of a rotation there, but their top 2 are Monty Rice, number 32, and Nakobe Dean, number 17. If that name, Nakobe Dean, sounds familiar, it's because he was an Alabama target in the recruiting cycle of 2019. 5-star, just one of those new age, athletic coverage inside linebackers who can really do it all. He ends up picking Georgia over Alabama at the last minute. But both of those guys, Monty Rice and Nakobe Dean, bring a lot of speed. You know, you can blitz them up the middle. They can cover a running back out to the flat. Just on a regular outside zone run, they're really quick getting out there, and they're solid tacklers out on the perimeter. So Jordan Davis clogging things up in the middle, and for any of those outside runs or a screen, Monty Rice and Nakobe Dean for Georgia are going to be important guys to keep an eye on. Going back to that Alabama offensive line, Nick Saban talked about them having some struggles with the communication over the first 2 weeks, and, you know, Missouri and Texas A&M show a little bit of movement. They do some stunts. They do just these tactics to throw off Alabama's offensive line and test their communication and make sure they're on the same page. And in many of those cases, they weren't. Late in the game against Missouri, Bryce Young was sacked twice, and that was still with the first-team offensive line in front of him, because they stunted and they moved guys around and swapped assignments, and Alabama's offensive line had some trouble figuring out who was supposed to block who. When you look at Mac Jones's interception against Texas A&M, it was tipped, and a sack that he took against Ole Miss, both of those were a result of an unblocked defender screaming into the backfield off of the left-hand side of the line because there was just some kind of miscommunication or mental error on the offensive line that resulted in them being completely unaccounted for in the blocking scheme. So you can see easily the effects of the offensive line not being on the same page. And that's not to mention the 8 false starts that Alabama has had on offense in just 3 games. Now, not all of those have been on the offensive linemen, but that either tells you that something is going wrong in the huddle, or when guys have taken their stances and they're calling out, you know, whether they're changing the protection or just making sure everyone knows where they're, it's called the mic point, like where they direct their run blocking scheme. There's a disconnect somewhere about the snap count. Just guys aren't on the same page. So 8 false starts, that just, you can't do that. And Nick Saban talked about that after game 2 against Texas A&M and said, we've got to get it corrected. And then 3 more false starts against Ole Miss. And 2 of those were down in the red zone, and Devontae Smith bailed him out with a 14-yard rushing touchdown. But eventually, when you have these pre-snap penalties, which Nick Saban said are just all about focus and discipline, those are going to catch up to you eventually. And going into a home game against a conference rival that's ranked number 3 in the country is not the time that you want to still be dealing with these kind of pre-snap, just silly little penalties. So I do expect Georgia's defense to give them some of that movement and just kind of poke and prod at them and say, have you guys gotten those communication issues figured out? Because if not, we're going to knock your quarterback around a little bit. And I especially think Georgia's going to do that on third down. Georgia's defense is ranked number 10 in the FBS out of 76 teams on third down, and number 2 in the SEC, behind South Carolina, surprisingly. Shout out to the Gamecocks there and Will Muschamp. One of the things I noticed that Georgia really likes to do on third down or otherwise, but especially on third down, is to show a regular rush, like they're just going to rush their front 4 guys, but then they'll drop one of their outside linebackers into coverage and blitz a corner or a safety. They especially did that against Tennessee. So Nick Saban was actually asked about Georgia's pass rush and all the different players that they play and different looks that they like to give an offense on the SEC coaches teleconference earlier this week. Here's what he had to say about Georgia's pass rush.
Well, they do play a lot of players, which is, in this day and age of football, I think is a really good thing. It's great for the players to have the opportunity, but it's also helpful in keeping everybody fresh. I do think they have some guys that can rush, 13, 19. They got a lot of team speed, so even when they, do their simulated pressures, they've got, defensive backs and other people rushing. And, so they do a really, really good job of pressuring the quarterback, a lot of times with just 4 guys rushing. And they use some alternative pressures to do it, but I think their pass rush is really, really good.
So that's Nick Saban talking about the pass rush of his protege, his longtime assistant and defensive coordinator, Kirby Smart. I haven't even mentioned Kirby yet, but we'll get to him later. But on the subject of Georgia's pass rush, the question that Saban was responding to there was about Kirby Smart saying that he doesn't really view any of Georgia's pass rushers as that one superstar pass rusher, but they just bring a lot of depth, and they bring a lot of different guys who can get the job done, whether that's off the edge or up the middle with your interior linemen. But Saban did mention 2 guys there specifically, and that's another key matchup that I want us to keep an eye on. So he mentioned 13 and 19. 13 is outside linebacker Azeez Ojulari, pretty cool name there. Ojulari was the SEC Defensive Lineman of the Week last week after having 2 sacks and 2 forced fumbles against Tennessee. In total this year, over 3 games, he has 3 sacks, 3 forced fumbles, and 6 tackles for loss, which is the most in the SEC through 3 games. So that's Azeez Ojulari. He's on the field just about every snap for Georgia, number 13 off the edge. Saban also mentioned number 19, Adam Anderson, who's a former 5-star linebacker, but he's only 225. So when you have a guy who's that size, he's 6'5", 225, and a guy with that size, you can do a lot of different things with. So like I said earlier, when Georgia likes to show just a typical 4-man rush look, but then they'll drop an outside linebacker, a lot of times that's who they're dropping, number 19, Adam Anderson, because he has still the size to go up against an offensive tackle and get to the quarterback, but he also has the twitchy, quick athleticism to drop into coverage and play man-to-man on a tight end or a running back, or you can blitz him off the edge. He can show like he's going to drop into coverage, and then they can blitz him. They had a play against Auburn where they did that. You have, I believe it was Ojulari, rush to the outside of the tackle, another defensive lineman go to the inside with the guard in the center, and then those guys split, and it just leaves a wide open just canyon for Adam Anderson to sprint through. And with a guy who's only 225, he's just barely bigger than a safety. But he still has the bulk to play linebacker and to bring a quarterback down. So he's really the ideal type of defender for the modern age of college football. So that's number 19, Adam Anderson. Look for him, especially in third and long situations, 3rd and 8. It'll probably be Ojulari and Anderson off the edge. Watch what they do with Adam Anderson. Watch if they bring him as part of a blitz, or if he shows blitz and then backs off and is kind of sitting there daring Mac Jones to throw it over the middle, or running out with Najee Harris, for example, to the flat. Very interested to see how Georgia and Kirby Smart will use Adam Anderson. And then the third edge guy I want us to focus on is Nolan Smith. He's not a starter. He's number 4, but he was the number 1 overall player in the 2019 recruiting class. So that kind of tells you about this Georgia defense. If the number 1 overall player nationwide in the 2019 class is not a starter for them yet. He's a talented player. He plays a good bit, but he comes off the bench for the Bulldogs. So that's Nolan Smith, number 4. And how those 3 guys stack up against Alabama's left tackle Alex Leatherwood and right tackle Evan Neal, I'm very interested to see. Leatherwood is as solid as they come, one of the best tackles in college football. I'm not too worried about him, but still, that matchup of him, and he'll probably be matched up with Ogletree a good amount of the time because Ogletree often plays that right side of the defense matched up with Leatherwood on the left side of the offense. But then Nolan Smith comes in for Ogletree sometimes on the right side, so how will he stack up with Leatherwood? And then Anderson a lot of the times is on the left side of the defense, so he'd be going against Evan Neal. And that's a matchup that Alabama fans might be a little bit more concerned about. The speed, the first step, the quickness of Anderson against Neal, who's a great player, but he's 360 pounds. And he's trying to keep up and get in the way of a 225-pound guy with an elite explosive first step. That might be a matchup that Georgia wants to exploit a little bit, so we'll see if Evan Neal can hold up there. And just overall, this personnel matchup of Alabama's offense and Georgia's defense is fascinating to me. Because Alabama has such talented and athletic skill players. Devontae Smith, Jalen Waddle, John Mechie starting to really make a name for himself. That it almost makes you, if I'm playing defensive coordinator for a moment, it almost makes me want to be in dime, just put a bunch of defensive backs out there and just drop 8 guys into coverage and try to prevent these ridiculously talented skill players from getting open. But at the same time, Alabama's offensive line is possibly the biggest in college football. And it's probably bigger than a lot of NFL offensive lines. So they're so big and can maul you at the line of scrimmage. And Najee Harris is such a powerful, rugged runner that if you're just putting a bunch of quick athletes out there to cover, they're going to eat you alive. So it really puts a defensive coordinator in a bind about what's the best way to defend these guys with these crazy talented skill guys who can get open anywhere on the field. But this O-line and this running back is kind of a little bit of a throwback with the way that they run it. And really, if I were creating a defense in a lab to defend Alabama, it might be Georgia's. I mean, they have the size up front with Jordan Davis, like I mentioned. They've got a good rotation there of defensive linemen. But the speed off the edge with Ogletree, Anderson, and Smith, they have a very good secondary. They've got a safety, Richard LeCount, who's been around forever. He's a first-team All-SEC guy in the preseason, number 2 back there. LeCount, the safety. And they've got a lot of experience in the secondary. So I think most of you would agree with me, and most college football fans would agree with me, that matchup, just the Alabama offense as a whole versus the Georgia defense as a whole, is the premier. It may be the premier position group matchup in college football this year. I mean, I don't know. I'm rambling on this a little too much now, but I can't get over how excited I am to get to the press box later today. Hopefully it stays warm. Hopefully the weather holds up for us. Because that matchup, I'm just going to be eating my popcorn. Very excited to see how that pans out. Moving to the other side of the defense, before I get into the actual matchups on the field between Alabama and Georgia, I want to talk for a moment about Alabama defensive coordinator Pete Golding. I know a lot of you Alabama fans probably rolled your eyes and you're already typing in the comment section or something. Get rid of Golding, put in Charlie Strong, promote Charlie Strong to defensive coordinator. Well, I'm here to tell you again, we need to pump the brakes a little bit, all right? I understand this Alabama defense for the last year has not been what y'all are used to seeing. I get it. But I don't get why you think Charlie Strong is the answer. Aaron Suttles is a great beat writer for The Athletic, and he tweeted earlier this week the ranks of Charlie Strong's defenses over his last 5 years. And they're not good. So I get that you guys want Nick Saban to make a change, and that Pete Golding, to this point in his career, hasn't overseen a defense that is like what we're used to seeing from Alabama. But that doesn't mean that you rush into a big change and kick Pete Golding out the door and say, congratulations, Charlie Strong, you're now Alabama's defensive coordinator. I think that would be a bit premature. But I think the job of a defensive coordinator is 4 things. I was thinking about this week after the Ole Miss game, actually even before the Ole Miss game, just in terms of Pete Golding and what the responsibilities of a defensive coordinator are. So here's my theory, and here's my, I guess, model of what a defensive coordinator has to be able to do. He has 4 things that he has to do. Number 1, you've got to understand the defensive concepts. You've got to know what coverages are good against certain pass concepts. You've got to know what fronts are going to work against a certain offense's run scheme. You've just got to have a good defensive mind and a good understanding of what works against what. So if I were to pair a location with each of these responsibilities, a DC has got to be good on the whiteboard. He's got to understand the concepts. He's got to be good on the whiteboard. Number 2, he's got to be able to teach the concepts to his players. And he's got to understand that different guys learn in different ways. So he's got to be, once he has it in his own head, he's got to be an effective communicator, and he's got to be able to communicate it in multiple different ways so guys with different learning styles can grasp it. So our location for that is the position meetings. So he's got to understand it and be able to do it on the whiteboard. He's got to be able to teach it to his guys in position meetings. Number 3, on the practice field, he's got to be able to motivate and inspire his players. They can't be complacent, This knowledge isn't enough. You've got to have the energy. You've got to somehow, whatever it is, you've got to inspire your guys on defense to go out and, like Nick Saban said, and I apologize for the language for anyone who may not like this, but Nick Saban famously said, make their ass quit. And as a defensive coordinator, that's the mentality that you've got to pass on to your guys. So when you're out at practice, you can't be lax. You've got to have that energy. You've got to motivate and inspire them. And especially here at Alabama, there's a standard that you play to. So a defensive coordinator's got to be able to do that. So the whiteboard, position meetings, the practice field, and then maybe most importantly, the sideline on game day. The defensive coordinator's got to tie it all together. He's got to apply his knowledge of the defensive scheme and of his roster into his play calling. And he's got to be able to make adjustments in the flow of the game, see what the offense is doing, maybe how does that differ from what you expected them to do, and then you adjust. You adjust your game plan, you adjust how you're playing this coverage. Maybe you're playing press on a certain receiver. Well, that's not working to that side of the field, so maybe you play a little bit more off. You just have to play it by ear. So you can't get too tunnel vision on your game plan, and you've got to be flexible and able to adjust. So what really got me pondering these responsibilities of a defensive coordinator was a piece by Bruce Feldman of The Athletic about Pete Golding when Pete was first hired to be Alabama's defensive coordinator back in early 2019. So in this piece by Bruce Feldman, it talks about how Pete Golding was kind of this defensive savant. Like his coaches in high school and college could tell that he was understanding it at an elite level and just had a future in coaching and was great at motivating, great at teaching guys once he got into the coaching profession, and that he was kind of a bright up-and-comer in the coaching profession. So this was what made me start pondering the responsibilities of a defensive coordinator. Now, during fall camp, Pete Golding was asked about what he learned from the defensive struggles of last year. And his answer, to me, was actually quite illuminating. He said, well, I wish I had audio for you guys. Sorry about that, of that Pete Golding press conference. But he said, what I learned was you can't spend so much time trying to focus on getting the exact right call for that situation, because that exact right call might not be what fits your personnel and your roster the best. And to me, the way I interpreted that is, this is a guy who is brilliant, who understands football at such a deep molecular level that he almost outsmarted himself sometimes. That he was so confident in this particular call being the exact right way to defend what he expected the offense to do, that he maybe forgot to put it in the context of his personnel. And especially last year, when you have two true freshman inside linebackers and true freshmen all over the place on the defensive line, you can't do that. You've got to consider the players that you have and what they're able to do. So I actually really liked that answer from Pete Golding back in August at the start of fall camp about what he learned. And that remark by Golding is what prompted me this week to go back to that and ask Nick Saban to kind of evaluate the defenses and really Pete Golding's ability to put the defensive players in position to be successful. So I thought long and hard about how to word this question to Nick Saban so as not to set him off and to get my point across. But I felt that with the defense through 3 games still not meeting expectations, I felt it was a question that needed to be asked. So here is Nick Saban's response to my question about are the defensive players on his team being put in position to be successful?
First of all, I don't think, that the call is necessarily the issue. I think the execution of the call has been the issue. Sometimes we coach players for what we want them to be, but we really need to coach them for what they are. And when I say that, I'm talking about how much experience do they have, how much can they handle, how much can they execute. So if the players are mis-executing, that's not a good thing from a coaching standpoint, because that means we have to do a better job of teaching them, or make sure we're not trying to teach them too much so they go out there and can't perform well with confidence and make the plays that we'd like for them to make. So you mentioned 2 players that have experience, but we have 11 guys out there at once. So it only takes one guy to make a mistake. And when everybody gives it my bad one time, that's 11 mistakes. Well, that can be a lot of yards. And, we've had some guys that have made multiple mistakes, and we either have to get it fixed or replace them. And we're going to work in every endeavor to try to get better. Believe me, no one's satisfied with the way we played. I think it was very challenging, pace of play, all that type of thing with some of the players that we have. And, a couple guys really contributed to a lot of those mental errors, but we just got to get them all fixed.
So Nick Saban was talking about putting his defensive players in position to be successful. He mentioned, in my question, I had specifically mentioned Dylan Moses and LeBron Ray. I asked him, now that you have those experienced guys back, how do you feel about the defense being put in position to be successful? So when he said 2 players, that was in reference to my question mentioning Moses and Ray. So that's really all I have on the Pete Golding subject. Let me know what you guys think. I know this is a very sore subject for a lot of Alabama fans. I want to know what you guys think about kind of my model of the 4 responsibilities of a defensive coordinator. And let me know what you think about that Saban quote, because I'm not going to lie, I was kind of nervous to ask him that one. And his response, I think, was pretty illuminating. That it's not the call. It's not that Pete Golding just doesn't have a clue and doesn't understand what coverages work against a certain offense. It's not that. I think there maybe is just still a little bit of that lingering unfamiliarity with how to tailor that extensive knowledge that Pete Golding has and apply it to the current roster in terms of what these inexperienced guys are able to comprehend and what they're able to process in their minds pre-snap. Because when you're going up against an up-tempo team like Ole Miss, you can't have very many thoughts in your mind at one time. You might only have a few seconds to process what's going on and how that changes your role relative to what everybody else needs to do. So let me know what you think about that. I'm very interested to see if you guys agree with me, partially agree, or just think I'm completely off base. So let me know. Moving on to this game, I've already gotten a little long-winded here trying to move it along, but Georgia's quarterback, Stetson Fleming Bennett IV, what a name, is an efficient guy. He's a game manager, he's accurate, he's a good distributor, Coach Saban said this week. Really, when I watch him play, I think he's the second coming of Jake Fromm. He's got a decent arm, makes good decisions, doesn't turn the ball over. Okay mobility, he can extend plays. Bennett actually ran for a touchdown against Tennessee. But they don't have the type of game-changing playmaking ability to carry the rest of the team when things break down. And another problem with Bennett is he's 3 inches shorter and 30 pounds lighter than Jake Fromm, and he has a much more suspect offensive line. So if the hits ever start to pile up, or if he goes out on a scramble and gets rocked by a linebacker or a safety, it might be a little bit more of a problem for Georgia's offense than it would be for, say, Jake Fromm. Another thing that I've noticed when watching Georgia's last couple of games is they have a lot of passes broken up at the line of scrimmage. They've had 16 total passes broken up, not necessarily just at the line of scrimmage, but 16 total passes broken up. At least 5 of them in every game, 6, 5, 5. Alabama has only had 6. So when I saw that number 16 for Georgia seemed high to me. So I wanted to put that into context for y'all. Alabama has had 6 passes broken up. Tennessee, just to throw in another SEC team, has had 9. So Georgia's number of 16 passes broken up through 3 games, it seems pretty darn high to me. And to me, it's very reasonable to think that Stetson Bennett's height, he's 5'11", could be a reason for that. And I think it could also be a function of Georgia's offensive line giving up a little bit more pressure than we're used to seeing from them. They had a lot of experience on that line last year, and now they don't have that much. Andrew Thomas was their left tackle, now with the New York Giants. Isaiah Wilson was their right tackle, now with the Tennessee Titans. Both of those guys were first-round picks. Those are big losses. Cade Mays, we've heard a lot about him with the NCAA and SEC eligibility waivers for transferring within conference. He's now at Tennessee. They lost him. He was a highly ranked recruit coming in. Their left guard from last year, Solomon Kinley, now at the Miami Dolphins. So they had a lot of turnover on that offensive line, and we'll get back to that a little bit later. But the protection's got to hold up for Stetson Bennett, because when he's well protected, he can drop some dimes. He had a beautiful floater down the sideline to his wide receiver, George Pickens, number 1, for a touchdown against Auburn. Beautiful. Just lofted it up there, dropped it perfectly in the bucket. He had a couple of really nice throws over the middle against Tennessee, and as we know, that's been a vulnerable spot for Alabama's defense. Have a little bit of audio from Saban after Ole Miss about defending the middle of the field. Let's get to that. I asked him, for a defensive-minded coach who is notoriously intent on defending the middle of the field with a strong defensive front, with elite middle linebacker play, and protecting the deep middle of the field with your safeties, what is the issue? So here's what he had to say after Ole Miss for really the second straight week of his defense having trouble defending the middle of the field. Here's Nick Saban after Ole Miss.
Well, I think it's a combination of things. I think we have to do a better job of playing blocks up front. I think we have to do a better job of fitting things with the linebackers in the secondary. I think we have to do a better job of coverage in the secondary. And the biggest issue, guys, is you got to get off the field on third down. And, we haven't done that yet this year, which extends drives and gives the other team more and more opportunities to make plays and score points. So, we've never played this way on defense. It's certainly not what we aspire to try to be as a defensive team, and we're going to work hard with our players. I believe in our players, and I think we have to get our players to play better. I think we're capable of it. I think this was a good offensive team, and there'll be a lot of opportunities for us to learn and grow from this game.
So that was Nick Saban talking after his defense gave up 48 points to Ole Miss about what they need to do to defend the middle of the field better. We saw it against Texas A&M with their tight end Jalen Weidermeyer just killing them time and time again over the middle, over the middle, over the middle. Another thing I noticed is they give up a lot of slants. A couple of those long third downs that they gave up to the Aggies were just a simple slant route from the slot receiver. And that's not what we're used to seeing from Alabama's defense. Saban mentioned the third down defense there. Alabama is usually great on third down. That's arguably one of the keys to having a championship level defense, is being able to get off the field on third down. Well, through 3 games this year, out of 76 teams in the FBS, where do you think Alabama ranks? I'll give you a couple seconds to ponder. Out of 76 teams, where do you think Alabama ranks in third down defense? 30th? 40th? 50th? No, they're 69th out of 76 teams in the FBS that have started their seasons. They allow opposing offenses to convert on third down 54% of the time. That's just not Alabama defense. I never thought I'd see the day that they were 69th out of 76 on third down. And a lot of Stetson Bennett's completions and where he appears to be the most comfortable throwing is over the middle. Against Tennessee, he had a couple of nice throws to a tight end up the seam against a linebacker. There was one play where the running back comes out of the backfield and does a little shake move and beats a linebacker over the middle for a 20-yard gain down in the red zone, down near the red zone. And then there were a couple wide receiver slants or a deeper post that was misplayed by Tennessee. And that's a conversion for Stetson Bennett and the Bulldogs offense. So to me, it looks like where he's most comfortable, talking about Bennett, is one of Alabama's weaknesses, and that's the middle of the field. So if Alabama's going to be able to get off the field on third down against a Georgia offense that leads college football in time of possession with more than 34 minutes per game, they must defend the middle of the field. That is absolutely essential. Part of that is going to be defending the tight end, and Alabama has not done that very well the last 2 weeks. Jalen Weidermeyer, like I mentioned, for A&M, had a career game 2 weeks ago. Kenny Yeboah for Ole Miss last week had a career game, which again, I called on the Ogletree Outlook and said he was good at getting open downfield. He has 2 touchdowns in a career game. This week, I don't think they will have quite as much trouble because I don't think Georgia's tight ends are quite as dynamic of a threat downfield, but they have 2 guys who are their top 2 threats at the position, Trey McKitty and Fitzpatrick, whose first name escapes me, but McKitty and Fitzpatrick, 86 and 87, are their top 2 tight ends. So, again, we'll see. We'll see how Alabama's linebackers are, like Nick Saban said in his audio a couple minutes ago, just how the defense is as a whole at communicating and get these guys covered. If the quarterback scrambles, which Stetson Bennett can do, which Matt Corral did, which Kellen Mond did, how does that affect your zone responsibilities? That was an issue against Ole Miss on a couple of plays as well. But again, Stetson Bennett's ability to find these guys is contingent on his protection. And his protection and the run blocking from Georgia's offensive line has been spotty. Tennessee got pressure on Stetson Bennett with just 3 rushers multiple times. Like I said, Georgia returns just 1 starter from last year. Their 5 guys who are expected to start this game against Alabama have made 52 total starts in their careers. By contrast, Alabama's 5 starting offensive linemen have made 95 total starts in their careers. That includes Landon Dickerson's previous starts at Florida State, in addition to his time once he transferred to Alabama. So, on paper, it looks like Alabama's defensive line should be able to get some push on Stetson Bennett. And when you get some pressure on Stetson Bennett, he's shown you the last couple weeks that he can be prone to some errant throws. When everything's going well, when he has time to look back and survey his options, he's very efficient and very accurate. When he has to move around a little bit, and he has to go off his first read, when he has pressure in his face, he's prone to giving you a couple wayward ones. Moving on to Georgia's receiving options, we talked about the tight ends a little bit, but they spread the ball around really well. Against Arkansas, they had 28 completions to 12 different receivers. Against Auburn, 17 completions to 7 different receivers. Tennessee, 16 completions to 9 different receivers. So all in all, 16 different players have caught at least 1 pass for Georgia this year. Alabama has had just 7, and 3 of those are wide receivers. So Georgia really spreads the ball around well. But their top guy, their top receiving option, is a guy who not many of us would have expected. I think coming into this year, George Pickens, the true sophomore from Hoover, Alabama, was thought to be the guy who would be the centerpiece of Georgia's passing game. He was a second-team preseason All-SEC honoree, but he's been the number 2 option, Pickens has, to slot receiver Keiris Jackson, who has had 27 targets in 3 games this year. Pickens second on the team with 15 targets. So Keiris Jackson, number 10, the Bulldogs slot receiver, looks to have a very good rapport with Bennett. Whether Bennett's being pressured or not, these guys have hooked up a lot. A couple plays against Auburn, Bennett was flushed, had to roll to his left and hit Keiris Jackson on an out route. There's another one down in the red zone where Jackson runs, I guess you'd call it a post from the right side. Bennett has to scoot a little bit to his left because of pressure and hits Jackson inside the 5-yard line, and they go on to score. So Keiris Jackson, number 10, the slot receiver, is the focal point of Georgia's passing game, and he looks to be matched up with Alabama's freshman star or nickelback, Malachi Moore. So I think when Georgia's on offense, that's going to be a matchup I'm interested to see how Malachi Moore can handle Georgia's top receiving option. So Keiris Jackson versus Malachi Moore will be a good one to watch there. And then as we wrap up here, Alabama's ability to stop the run, to me, has been pretty stout up the middle. Even last week against Ole Miss, there were a couple that got away from them, but they held the Rebels and Missouri and A&M the previous 2 weeks, for that matter, in check up the middle. But they've been rough around the edges. They really struggled to set the edge and play contain against Ole Miss's multiple slippery running backs. Jerry and Ely and Snoop Connor both had several plays where they got to the edge and there was just no one there. They take the snap, Alabama gets sealed inside, and they just have daylight out to the sideline. But what could be in Alabama's favor there is, like I said, Georgia's offensive line has been a little bit inconsistent, and their run game has not been explosive at all. Their longest run by a running back in 3 games is only 20 yards. They had a 43-yard run by one of their wide receivers against Tennessee, but that was on an end around, so a little bit of misdirection there. Statistically, you have to count it as a run, but when we're talking about how good they actually are at running the ball, I don't think that's super relevant. So when you exclude sacks, Georgia has improved. They started out at just around 4 yards a carry against Arkansas, and then just under 5 yards a carry against Auburn and Tennessee. But it's not an explosive running game at all. It's honestly a little bit like Alabama's. We know Najee Harris is a great player, but he doesn't have that breakaway speed. And that's kind of the style of Georgia's running game too. They'll break tackles, especially their true freshman Kendall Milton, who was also an Alabama target, who ends up picking Georgia. But out on the perimeter, he can break some tackles. And that's been a little bit of a problem for Alabama's defense as well the last couple of weeks. Tackling out on the perimeter, not wrapping guys up. Just, you go to tackle a guy and you just bounce off of him and he gets 5 more yards. So Milton is especially good at that. But Zamir White is Georgia's kind of bell cow there. Highly ranked recruit a couple years ago, finally getting his chance. Zamir White, number 3, will get most of the carries, but Kendall Milton is also going to factor in there. And then, in terms of Alabama's ability to stop the run, I think their linebackers are going to play a big role in that. Dylan Moses' willingness to get in there and kind of mix it up with blockers and throw himself on the pile. I'll be interested to see how willing he is to do that. Because going back and watching him against Ole Miss and A&M, some plays he looks like old Dylan Moses. He's flying around, he's putting his body on the line, and you would never guess that he had suffered a serious knee injury last year. But then there are other plays where he looks a little bit hesitant. And you can call this a reporter making something out of nothing or throwing some you-know-what at the wall and seeing what sticks, but I trust my eye, and there are some plays where it looks like Dylan Moses might still have a little bit of a mental hurdle left lingering from that knee injury last year. So, and 3 games may not be enough to overcome that. That might be something that is just gradual, and it's a process that he'll have to go through this year. I mean, he didn't play in a college football game for a year. It's not going to all come back right away. So, I'll be interested to see how much of the quote-unquote old Dylan Moses we continue to see throughout the season, especially against Georgia tonight. And then, let's not forget, last thing I want to touch on with Alabama's defense, Jordan Battle is missing the first half of this game. He was disqualified or ejected from the Ole Miss game for targeting. And since that occurred in the second half of that game, that means he has to miss the first half of this game. So that's one of your starting safeties who's not playing the first half, an entire half, of a huge football game against the number 3 team in the country. And when you think about what that might do to Alabama's defensive personnel and formations, I don't think it'll hurt them too much in nickel, because you still have DeMarco Hellams and Daniel Wright, who can play your 2 safety spots in nickel. But in dime, I don't know how confident they're going to be in that 6th defensive back that they'll have to put out there. I imagine it would be Brian Branch, the true freshman. You would probably... You could do a couple different things, because Branch can play safety. He's played star. I think he's played a little bit of money as well in practice, which is that 6th defensive back position. But not having Jordan Battle there really makes it tough for the coaches to decide what they're going to do there if they need to go in dime. I mean, if it's 3rd and 8, you've got your speedy pass rush guys on the field, and Georgia comes out there with 4 wide receivers, what are you going to do? I mean, are you trusting Christian Harris to pull it together and do what he can do? I mean, he played corner in high school, but playing linebacker and matching up one-on-one against a receiver in the SEC is a big step up from that. So I'm very curious to see how Alabama handles the dime defense, if they go into dime at all without Jordan Battle for the first half. And then that's all I wanted to say on the Alabama defense, but I would be remiss if I didn't talk about Scott Cochran for just a minute. So, as you know, Scott Cochran was with Nick Saban at Alabama since the beginning. Since 2007, he's been there. And leaves Tuscaloosa to go to Athens to pursue an on-field coaching position with Kirby Smart at Georgia. He's now their special teams coordinator. Well, so far, it seems to be working. Georgia punter Jake Camarda leads the FBS in yards per punt, and the Bulldogs have not allowed a single punt to be returned this year. And teams are finally starting to realize that you shouldn't punt to Jalen Waddle, going to the Alabama side, because he's only been able to return one punt this year. That was against A&M, and that went for 11 yards. So special teams is so often overlooked, especially when you have as many blue chip talented guys as you do in this game. But Scott Cochran's going to have a couple tricks up his sleeve. You know he would love to how do I put this? I got to word this carefully. You know he would love to prove to Nick Saban that he was worthy of an on-field coaching position, because Cochran reportedly approached Saban about expanding his role from strength and conditioning to something on the field. That was something Saban wasn't willing to do. Therefore, Cochran left Tuscaloosa to become a special teams coordinator at Georgia. And you know, he would love to show Nick Saban, hey, remember when you didn't think I could be a good special teams coordinator? Remember when I wasn't good enough for you? Well, how about that? So, after an Alabama touchdown, or an Alabama 3-and-out, or an Alabama incompletion on third down, or whatever, don't overlook the special teams. Don't start scrolling through Twitter. Don't go into the kitchen. Keep an eye on the special teams. Scott Cochran will be a storyline in this game. I'm telling you all that right now. Scott Cochran will make some headlines at some point later tonight in this game. And that is the thought I will leave you with. Thank you, as always, for listening to the Ogletree Outlook. Hope you guys have a great game day. Went a little bit long-winded this time. I'll try to keep that shorter in the future, but this is a big game. I got to give you as much information as I can to help you understand what's going on in this incredible matchup with all these chess pieces on Alabama's offense and Georgia's defense. I appreciate you listening. Let me know your thoughts on Pete Golding, Scott Cochran, Kirby Smart, Alabama. Potentially, I didn't even mention this, but they may have to coach without Nick Saban on the sideline. It looks like he will be there pending his third negative COVID test later this afternoon. But a lot of storylines swirling around. I did my best to kind of preview everything that'll be going on down there on the Bryant-Denny Stadium field. So let me know what you think. Thank you, as always, for listening to the Ogletree Outlook. I will be at the game covering it in person. Very grateful to be able to do that. I'll have a story out on Tide1009.com after the game. And as always, make sure you follow me on Twitter for clips and live tweeting of everything going on at the game. Follow me on Twitter at TheOgletree, TheOgletree. Have a good game day, everybody. Thanks for listening.